All right, y'all, what's up, man? Sean G here. Y'all want to see Luna? Look, Luna. Wait. Come here. She don't want to stay up here. Hold on, I gotta rub her on her belly. There she go. Got the best life in the world. You don't do nothing but eat and lay around. All right, so welcome to the podcast with Soul. My name is Sean G. The podcast with Soul, Stigmatism in My Soul, Gumby Publishing. None of us wish to slander, defame, libel, or cause any harm to anybody who we discuss in this court case that we're going to discuss today, which is the United States of America versus Dion Gatlin, which we all know and love as Cuffy out of St. Louis, or Cuff. Some of y'all may know him as Cuff. That's why I don't like picking her up, because all her hair get on. We are coming from the Franks hearing dated January 9th, 2017. This is a 192-page document. My allergies are real bad. It's real bad with allergies right now in North Jersey. Today is May the 2nd, 2025 is my mother's birthday. Shout out to my mother. Happy birthday to my mother. My mother's passed away. She passed away in 2020. Happy birthday to Mom Dukes. Look at my coffee with the steam. Look at my steam come rock out. I put it up to my shirt. See that steam? So, where we are now is the attorney for Andre Rush, who is one of the defendants in this case, Dion Gatlin, which is Cuffy, Tim Rush, Andre Rush, and I think his name is Lawrence Gibbs. 4 of those guys are defendants in this case. And this is Bob Herman, who's an attorney out of St. Louis. And he's cross-examining Keith Cromer on the stand. And he's showing Keith Cromer no mercy. I had a chance to speak to Keith Cromer on the phone. Keith Cromer is a good dude. I spoke to him twice actually on the phone. Once for about an hour and a half and another second time for about an hour. And I was impressed, and he got all my respect for even picking up the phone and talking to me about this case, because he has been looked at and characterized as the, I'm gonna be blowing my nose in this video because of my allergies. You hear how my noise, my sinuses sound? He has been looked at as like the fuck up of this case. That's the perception that everybody has of him. That was the perception that I had when the story was initially told to me. But after speaking with the man on the phone, the man is a gentleman. He's got a lot of courage and a lot of bravery. He talked to me about it. And, you know, most people duck and hide in shame and humiliation, but he came out front, and I hope one day he gives me a full interview. But anyway, he is, Keith Cromer is under attack on the stand. My eyes are itching. By Bob Herman about his agent misconduct getting involved in a non-permissible, prohibited social relationship with an informant who we all know as Tammy Cowins, or CS1. Bob Herman pulls out a picture of Keith Cromer sleeping in bed with a t-shirt on. And Bob Herman tells Keith Cromer on the stand that this picture was taken out of Tammy Cowins' phone. And the picture was taken by Tammy Cowins. Keith Cromer, my eyes are itching, y'all, from my allergies. Keith Cromer acknowledges the picture, but begins to explain or attempt to explain that he was on this trip with his friend, with his college roommate. He doesn't know how she took this picture. There were 2 hotel rooms rented during this trip, both rented by Keith Cromer. Keith Cromer testifies that him and his roommate stayed in one room, and him and his roommate stayed in one room, and Tammy Cowins stayed in the other room by herself. This is his testimony. Bob Herman dices that up and says that it doesn't matter. He pulls out the DEA handbook and references chapter 66. I think the paragraph is 6612.34 or something like that. We're going to read it. First, I like to come off the top of the dome to kind of just speak to you about it, and then we get into the paperwork to verify or corroborate what I'm saying off the top of the dome. And Bob Herman shows him a chapter in the DEA handbook, chapter 66, that there should never be less than 2 agents in the presence of an informant ever. Anytime a DEA agent or an IRS agent or an FBI agent meets with an informant, he can never do it alone, or else it's an express violation of DEA policy. Keith Cromer is on this trip. First, Keith Cromer tells Bob Herman on the stand that this was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Bob Herman asked him about Chattanooga, Tennessee. He says, yes, Chattanooga, Tennessee. Then, 2 or 3 questions later, Keith Cromer changes that testimony on the stand. He says, no, that was in Biloxi, Mississippi. First he says the picture was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Then he says the picture was in Biloxi, Mississippi. So that's not good to do that on the stand under oath. Number 2, also not good to have a social relationship with an informant. Bob Herman goes on to talk about that every 90 days, every informant has to have a quarterly review. The informant has to be brought in, sat down, and questioned about their activity for the prior 90 days. The person who does the interviewing of this quarterly review can never be the controlling agent. And a supervisor has to sit in on the interview. Bob Herman asks, how many quarterly interviews did you sit in on with Tammy Cowins? Cromer says either it was in late 2011 or early 2012. Keith Cromer also mentions that the first time he sat in on a quarterly review of Tammy Cowins was in 2010. when she was still under the control of Jack Harvey. Remember how we always thought that Keith Cromer doesn't meet her until 2011? That's not true. It's 2010. So Bob Herman then asks Keith Cromer, did you disclose in these quarterly interviews that you and CS1, Tammy Cowins, were having an illicit against DEA policy relationship, a social relationship that it had transcended from business to personal and social? Keith Cromer says, no, I didn't disclose it. Bob Herman asks him, did you ask Tammy Cowins to lie? If she was asked, was she ever with you alone? Or were you guys engaged in a social relationship? He denies that. And what's interesting, this is all going down in the middle of March 2012. We got to stay there. March 2012 is some key dates, because it's right before the wiretaps and application for the wiretaps, Title III and the affidavit. And this is the time that the special agent in charge of the St. Louis office leaves St. Louis and becomes the special agent in charge of the Atlanta office, all while this is going on. He also asked Keith Cromer, did you disclose to the DEA St. Louis agents when they interviewed you and Tammy Cowins for the affidavit and the Title III wiretaps? Did you disclose to the St. Louis DEA that you and Tammy Cowins were involved in an unprofessional, against DEA policy relationship, a social relationship? Did you tell DEA St. Louis that when they were preparing the affidavit and the Title III application for the wiretaps? He says, no, I didn't tell him that. Bob Herman tells Keith Cromer on the stand that Tammy Cowins testified under oath on the stand that intercourse, sexual intercourse, was a part of their relationship. Bob Herman asked Keith Cromer that on the stand. He says no, it was never sexual intercourse. Bob Herman says, so she's lying? Keith Cromer says yes. Bob Herman asks, so she's a liar? Keith Cromer says, yes, she's a liar. So here's another thing. You got two conflicting stories about details of this relationship. So somebody's perjuring themselves on the stand, whether it's Tammy Cowins or Keith Cromer, who knows? And you have the group supervisor of DEA Atlanta calling the informant that he controlled a liar, which impugns, pokes a hole in her credibility. Yet, both of these people and their recollection and testimony is used in the affidavit and the application for the Title III wiretaps to incriminate Cuffy. So much has gone wrong here. So much of this is so wrong. And this is why Cuffy, his case needs to be reviewed. He needs to be set free. Number one, he's did enough time already. What has he done? 11, 12 years? He's done enough time. And the misconduct and the misapplication of justice is just glaring, that everything went wrong with this investigation. Yet, this affidavit and this Title III wiretaps was used to prosecute Cuff. Page 123 of 192. Let's read it together. This is Bob Herman, the attorney. Good afternoon, Keith. My name is Bob Herman. I represent Andre Rush in this matter. Keith Cromer, good afternoon, sir. Bob Herman. I don't have any affidavits to show you, but I do have a picture I want to show you. And I'm going to show you what has been marked as Gibbs 1. And that's you, isn't it? Keith Cromer, do you have a better photo of that? Herman, do you have another one here? Judge, may I approach? The judge, you may. Shows him the picture. That's you? Keith Cromer, yes, sir. Bob Herman, what are you doing in that picture? Keith Cromer, sleeping. Bob Herman, so you're sleeping at home? Are you at home? No, sir. Bob Herman, where are you sleeping? Whenever I ask the question, that's going to be the attorney, Bob Herman, and when I give a definitive statement, that's going to be the answer of Keith Cromer. So if I don't say who it is, you know. Bob Herman, where are you sleeping? Keith Cromer. That's in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Bob Herman, Chattanooga, Tennessee? Keith Cromer, yes, sir. And can you explain exactly where Tammy Cowins was standing when she took that picture of you? I don't know. Well, she had to be in the same room there. Keith Cromer, I don't know where she was standing. Bob Herman, was she on the other side of the bed there taking that picture of you? Keith Cromer, I don't know, sir, where that picture came from. This is the first time. Bob Herman, that picture comes from Tammy Cowins' telephone. Keith Cromer, yes. And it's taken March the 10th, 2012. Correct. So she's there with you, with her camera, taking a picture of you sleeping. Keith Cromer, yes, sir. That doesn't include the other people who were there on that trip, but yes, that's a picture of me sleeping, yes. Bob Herman, were all those other people sleeping in the same room with you? Keith Cromer, no, sir. So she's in there while you're sleeping? Keith Cromer, yes, sir. Bob Herman, and was there another agent present? No, sir. Bob Herman, so right there, that's a prohibited relationship. Keith Cromer, it is. Bob Herman, you do understand there are rules governing how you interact with a confidential agent or a confidential informant, right, Mr. Cromer? Yes, sir. One of the rules is if at all times, unless it's absolutely necessary or unless it's absolutely impossible, you have to have 2 or more agents with the confidential informant, right? Correct. And that was just you and Tammy Cowins, wasn't it? Yes. As far as from, yes, sir. And that's as early as March of 2012. That violates Keith Cromer. No. March of 2012. Bob Herman, it says March 10th, 2012, I believe right here. Do you see that? It says date taken, right? Keith Cromer, yes, sir. Date taken March 10th, 2012 at 8:37 in the morning. That was the trip that you took with Tammy Cowins to Chattanooga. Bob Herman. Keith Cromer. No. In March 2012, you're mistaken. In March 2012, that was in Mississippi in March 2012. So he just said before that it was Chattanooga. Now he's saying that it's Mississippi. A couple of questions later. You were in Mississippi gambling, right? Yes, sir. With Tammy Cowins? Keith Cromer, no. Right here, that's why I said something is wrong, because Tammy Cowins wasn't in the room with me when this photo was taken. I didn't stay in the room with Tammy Cowins. I was in the room with my best friend from college, Bob Herman. So you think Tammy Cowins' camera, cell phone camera, was in the room with you, but not Tammy Cowins? Is that what you're telling us? Keith Cromer, I stayed in the room with my best friend from college. We were there and we shared a room together. Bob Herman, and are you telling us now that he took Tammy Cowins' phone and took a picture of you? Keith Cromer, you have the photo. The circumstances surrounding it, I don't know. But I was there with my best friend from college. Bob Herman, and Tammy Cowins. Keith Cromer, she went on the trip unbeknownst to either one of us. Bob Herman, she went on the trip and you paid for it. No, you paid for the room. Keith Cromer, I prepaid for, I bought 2 rooms, one for myself and one for my college roommate. Bob Herman, sir, you paid for the room. Keith Cromer, I paid for both rooms. Herman, good, that's easy, isn't it? Question, answer. That is a social relationship. That wasn't a business relationship, right? Keith Cromer, correct. That was a social relationship, yes. Social relationships are specifically, expressly prohibited, correct. And there wasn't another agent in the room with her. Were there any other agents on the trip? Keith Cromer, no. There was my best friend from college. He was there, and he was Bob Herman. Just a moment. And your best friend from college, he's not an agent. Keith Cromer, no. Bob Herman. So that violates another rule. You're having contact with a confidential source without having another agent present. Keith Cromer, yes, sir. Bob Herman, 2 strikes. Keith Cromer, there are one and the same. Bob Herman, well, they are different rules. You know the rules I'm talking about, don't you? You want to see them? You recognize that there are written rules about how to govern yourself as an agent with respect to, yes, sir. That is chapter 66, enforcement procedures. Yes, sir. Do you recognize that? Yes. Bob Herman. So I'm going to look at 6612.31, paragraph B. Agent and informant contacts will be of strictly professional nature. Extrinsic social and business contacts are expressly prohibited. Keith Cromer, yes, sir. Bob Herman, you were having a prohibited relationship with her by taking her on this trip, by paying for her hotel room and having her along on this trip, correct? Keith Cromer, no. Bob Herman, so what? Keith Cromer, let me speak. The contact was prohibited, you're correct. Bob Herman, the contact was prohibited, okay. Now, let me go on to the next one. Keith Cromer, no. The judge, let him ask the question, Agent Cromer. Bob Herman, let me ask the questions, please. Okay, Keith Cromer says. The contact was prohibited. Keith Cromer, yes, sir. Now, Bob Herman, you let her take a picture of you sleeping? And so we look at C. Contacts with informants will be such that their knowledge of DEA facilities, operations, activities, and personnel is kept to a minimum necessary to their successful utilization. Does taking a picture of you while you're sleeping in your hotel room, is that necessary to the professional relationship between you and the confidential informant, Tammy Cowins? Yes or no? Keith Cromer, no, sir. I didn't even know the picture was taken. Bob Herman, that's the answer. That's the answer. All right. Now, that's strike 2. Strike 3. At least 2 agents must be capable of contacting an informant. All right? Whenever practical, 2 agents or an agent and an officer of another enforcement agency will be present at all contacts with the informant. Strike 3. There were only you and Tammy Cowins, right? No other agents. Keith Cromer. Yes, sir. Bob Herman. A prohibited relationship. Keith Cromer. Yes, sir. Strike 3. Now, how many of these prohibited relationships? Oh, wait, one more second. One more. Strike 4. All significant contacts having her along on this trip, that was a significant contact. It was a multi-day contact with her, wasn't it? Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Wasn't it? You were there with her for a couple of days. Keith Cromer, it was for 2 days. Bob Herman, 2 days. That's significant contact. So all significant contacts with the informant shall be documented in writing. Did you document your trip to Mississippi with Tammy Cowins in writing? No, sir. Strike 4. Now, how many people did you tell that you were having this prohibited relationship with Tammy Cowins? Keith Cromer. No one. You didn't tell your supervisor? No, sir. You didn't tell any of the other agents you worked with? That's correct? Yes, sir. And you certainly didn't tell the agents from St. Louis when you talked to them with respect to this affidavit, the application for wiretap, that you were having an extended, personal, prohibited relationship with Tammy Cowins. Isn't that correct? Keith Cromer, correct. Now, there are procedures to keep this sort of thing at a minimum within the agency, correct? Keith Cromer, yes. And one of those procedures is a supervisory interview. Is that what you call it? So all informants, confidential informants, have to be interviewed on a 90-day quarterly review. Yes, sir. And that quarterly review is not done by the controlling agent, right? They are present, yes. Well, they are present, okay, so, but the questioning is done by a supervisor. Cromer, no, sir. The supervisor just sits in on the interview. Bob Herman. Now, you are aware, or maybe you're not, that, well, let me ask you. So you sat in on, how many supervisory interviews did you sit on with Tammy Cowins? How many quarterly reviews of Tammy Cowins did you sit in on? Keith Cromer, at least once a quarter. Bob Herman, so you dealt with her maybe 6 quarters. Keith Cromer, no. Yes, 5 or 6. Bob Herman, 5 or 6. Keith Cromer, yes, sir. So during the first quarter interview that you sat in on, you had already been engaging in a prohibited relationship with Tammy Cowins. Keith Cromer, no, sir. All right. When was the first quarterly interview that you sat in on? Keith Cromer, 2010. Bob Herman, okay. So when's the first quarterly interview that you sat in on that you had been in fact engaging in a prohibited relationship with Tammy Cowins? Keith Cromer, the last quarter of 2011 or the first quarter of 2012? Bob Herman, so at that time, so let's say the last quarter of 2011, you had already began to engage in a personal prohibited relationship with Tammy Cowins, correct? Keith Cromer, yes, sir. And then you go to a supervisory quarterly interview, and does nobody ask her questions about have you had individual contact with Agent Cromer on an other than professional basis? They ask you that question? Keith Cromer, I don't believe so. Bob Herman, nobody says, have you ever met with Cromer? Nobody asked Tammy Cowins, have you met with Cromer outside of work? Keith Cromer, maybe you're talking about a self-inspection, but not in a quarterly report. That wouldn't be there. Bob Herman, did you disclose that to the person doing? You should have disclosed it, shouldn't you, Mr. Cromer? Yes, sir. But you didn't. No, sir. You withheld that information. Yes. You knew it was important. Important to her credibility, Keith Cromer. No, the credibility had nothing to do with it. What it had to do with I talked to them in dealing and coping with my son's death, and that's where Bob Herman stops him. Let's not go there, Keith Cromer. But you don't want to go there. But that's what the interaction was about, was dealing with that right there. The judge. Well, Agent Cromer, I'm going to ask you to confine your answers to the questions asked. Keith Cromer. Yes, ma'am. The judge. And I'm going to start striking testimony that's not responsive. Keith Cromer. Yes, ma'am. Bob Herman. When you were engaged with a quarterly interview with your supervisor concerning Tammy Cowins, did you or Tammy Cowins disclose to the supervisor that the two of you had been engaging in a prohibited relationship? Keith Cromer. No, sir. Bob Herman. And then there was a follow-up quarterly interview where you continued to engage in a expressly prohibited relationship, and you didn't disclose it then either, did you? Keith Cromer. The quarter is almost over a year or something where I didn't see them in person at all. That was outside. I wouldn't have violated during that time. Bob Herman, any quarterly review that you had, you never disclosed it to anyone that you and Tammy Cowins had been engaging in a prohibited, non-professional, social relationship. Keith Cromer. Yes, sir. Correct. Bob Herman. That's correct, right? Keith Cromer. Yes. Bob Herman. And in fact, in Tammy Cowins' testimony, she testified that you specifically instructed her to lie about the fact that you were engaged in a prohibited relationship, and she says intimate relationship. So you're telling us now today that she's a liar? Keith Cromer. Yes. Bob Herman. So we got that established. Keith Cromer. Let's put it on the table, sir. As I told you, Bob Herman, stop. Let me ask the questions, please. Keith Cromer. Okay. Bob Herman. She testified that you two were intimate all the way to the point of intercourse. Are you telling us that she's a liar? Keith Cromer. That's not true. Correct, sir. Bob Herman. She's a liar? Keith Cromer. Yes, sir. Bob Herman. But you knew there was a relationship that despite how far you say it went, and we know there's a picture of you sleeping here in your undies that she took on her camera. Keith Cromer. I'm not seeing my undies. Bob Herman. That looks like a t-shirt to me. I don't know what you got under the covers there, but I don't care either, really. The judge. Mr. Herman, please ask a question. Bob Herman. That's you in the bed sleeping. Yes, sir. That's a very personal and intimate picture. Keith Cromer. That's a personal picture. Yes, sir. And she's got that on her camera. Yes, sir. And she should not have. Keith Cromer. I agree. Yes, sir. The U.S. Attorney jumps up. Can we move on, Judge? We beat this to death. The judge. I agree. Bob Herman. All right. And you didn't disclose that. And when the time came for you to tell the agents in St. Louis about her credibility and vouch for her credibility, you didn't disclose that there was this personal, unauthorized, prohibited relationship. Isn't that true? Keith Cromer. That's true. Correct. This is from page 123 of 192 to 136 of 192. Free Cuffy.